And we're back now with our panel to discuss the climate deal. Karl, what's wrong with this agreement, and is there anything in it that's useful?
Well, two things. I was interested in the comment of Dr. James Hansen, sort of the high priest of global warming, who said it was BS because it didn't have targets. It calls for no net new emissions to be, that's the target, 2050 to 2080. We'll all be dead, and very few of the people who are sitting in Paris will be alive at that point, I suspect, when we hit to 2080. Look, the United States has reduced its greenhouse gas emissions. It has done so not because of some international treaty, but because for more than a decade, we have put the focus on energy efficiency. We're a market economy. We're a wealthy country that can afford to do this, and we have done it. What we are now doing is saying to emerging economies, keep your people poor, keep them in poverty, because you cannot use cheap fuels, namely natural gas, coal, and other fossil fuels to power your economy. And it's ridiculous. I think it made everybody there feel good, but I think Dr. Jim Hansen is right. Absent compulsory targets, which nobody in the world would accept, the emerging economies or a country like the United States, this is the best they can do, and now they're going to try and browbeat us into beggaring our economy.
Neera, I want to talk about this lack of sanctions, which is a dramatic fact. I mean, a lot of pledges, no sanctions, and one of the concerns is that an open society like the United States will in effect have to keep its pledges, but that a much more closed society like China will renege, and there's nothing we can do about it.
Well, I mean, the agreement has its strongest provisions are its accountability provisions. So everyone has to report what's happening.
But there's no enforcement.
Right, and I think the issue there is that it's hard for international climate agreement, in part because, as Carrie said, our own Congress, to have that level of teeth. And I think China is a great example. For years, we heard from people like Karl Rove saying that China would never agree to take any action. They're the world's biggest polluter.
When did I say that exactly?
In 2008, 2009, and 2010.
Sure, right.
Okay. And then the administration took action, and China took action. And that has led to this agreement.
Wait a minute. China has built about 100 coal-powered plants around the world in the last couple of years.
And China has actually also adopted a cap-and-trade program in China.
But it's still building the coal-powered plants.
Absolutely, and that is why this agreement is important, so that we can actually see what is happening around the world to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. At the end of the day, 197 countries are party to this. 180 have come up with their own agreements. I think that is something we should celebrate, because the world, maybe not the Republican Party in the United States, but the rest of the world recognizes that climate change is a threat to the planet and is taking action.
George, I want to pick up on that, and I'm confused because sometimes I hear it's 196, sometimes 197, but anyway, it's a lot of nations, almost 200. Rich and poor, open, democratic, some repressive, have all agreed to something. Does that in some way discredit the climate change deniers?
No. First, any agreement about any subject involving 190-some nations is going to be necessarily at a high level of generality and almost entirely voluntary in all its provisions. Climate deniers, no one sensible, I don't know anyone who denies that the climate is changing, because it's always changing. Chris, I'm from Illinois. 20,000 years ago, which is a geological blink, Chicago, what is now Chicago, was under a mile of ice. Of course the climate is changing. The question is the world sensibly obsessing about this subject when 1 billion people on this planet are off the grid, don't have electricity, and hundreds of millions of people on this planet have the most urgent problem, finding drinkable water?
Yes,
Chuck, if I may.
Sure.
Chuck, I'd like to bring you in, because I found it interesting that repeatedly in that interview, at least 3 times, so it must be true according to the rule of Trump, Secretary Kerry blamed the weaknesses in this agreement, the lack of enforcement on the Senate-controlled, Republican-controlled Senate, result of which is that once again, as with the Iran deal, it's not a treaty and Congress is cut out.
Well, you know, I think if they had tried to do a treaty, something like what happened with Kyoto would have happened, is that not only there would have been, of course, massive Republican objection, but there would have been some Democrats who would have been from coal-burning states who would have been on the spot, people like Sherrod Brown from Ohio and so forth. But China and India would never have agreed to anything that had committed them in an enforceable way, that put like the United States in charge of policing their energy use. That wasn't going to happen. So I thought what you were going to say was that he said 3 times, this gives a message to the markets, which is what they're sort of, hanging their hat on in this agreement. I think that's a really interesting point. But there's another message going out to the markets right now, and that is the price of oil is $36 a barrel. This thing is going to be determined based on which signal people out there in the real world actually listen to. Is it going to be...
This idea that the administration is talking about is the message to the market is the idea that all of the venture capitalists, all of the big companies out there are going to decide, you know what, our future and where we need to make the investments is not in fossil fuels, but rather in alternative energy.
Look, if I could just say one point on that, to what Karl said about how the U.S. brought down its emissions, it's largely through the introduction of natural gas, which was done through fracking, which a lot of environmentalists are against. There's going to have to be trade-offs. Angela Merkel, the person of the year in Time, is also the same person who canceled Germany's nuclear power program. And if that made her probably the biggest contributor to carbon emissions in recent years. So we're going to have to, if we're going to get these emissions down, we're going to have to embrace certain technologies like nuclear and natural gas that many environmentalists are not comfortable with.
And also solar, which has grown and has actually had the largest increase in jobs domestically in the United States over the last several years.
All right.
Particularly companies like Solyndra.
Well, I'm enjoying this, guys. I hope you're picking up all the subtext here between Karl and Neera. We have to step aside for a moment.